The movie begins with a panoramic view of a large desert. The view confines into the eyes of Richard, who's in his private helicopter with his girlfriend, Jen. They soon land near a beautiful house in the middle of the desert. As a welcome gift, the helicopter pilot gives Richard a small packet of a plant named peyote, whereas Jen is exploring the house and reaches the bedroom. When Richard enters the bedroom, Jen seduces him, and they end up having a romantic and intimate night. A few moments later, Richard receives a call that reveals that he's a married man and that he's cheating on his wife. However, he still returns to bed with Jen and spends a night with her, and it seems like Jen knows about his marriage as well. The next morning, Jen wakes up in her underwear and goes to the kitchen. She pours some water into the glass and grabs an apple to take a bite. As she turns around, she's shocked to see two men standing outside the house. It turns out that they're Richard's friends, but he's not happy to see them arrive earlier than he expected. He wanted to keep his relationship with Jen a secret, but now they know about it. Nevertheless, he introduces one of them as Stan and the other as Dimitri, and the three men have plans to hunt together. Meanwhile, Stan seems to have an interest in Jen and her appealing body. That evening, the four of them are seen sitting by the side of the pool and talking to each other. Meanwhile, Dimitri's attention is grabbed by peyote lying on the table. When he asks about it, Richard explains that it's a hallucinogenic drug that has severe effects. He further adds that one time, a person ate this drug, and while he was tripping, he cut his own legs since he felt no pain. Seeing the boys getting interested in the peyote, Richard asks Jen to hide the drug somewhere safe. Surprisingly, Jen's also interested in the drug, and hence she keeps it inside her locket. After that, she plays music and starts dancing to entertain Richard and his friends. She transforms herself into a showgirl, and among the three, Stan seems to be passionately interested in her. To his luck, Jen asks Stan for a dance together, and while they dance, they get a little too close physically, and as a result, Richard and Jenny go off to sleep. The following morning, Jen wakes up to look for Richard. Stan informs her that he's out for some work and that he'll only be back in the afternoon. On the other hand, Dimitri is making efforts to deal with his hangover. Stan desperately wants to spend time with Jen, but she shows no interest and goes back to her room. While in the room, Stan sneaks in to watch Jen changing her clothes. He then enters the room where he outwardly confesses that he wants to get intimate with her, but Jen rejects his advances. Unable to handle the rejection, he gets furious and sexually assaults her. Dimitri sees everything that's happening, but he decides to ignore the assault. Instead, he leaves them alone and turns on the TV to avoid Jen's cry for help. A few hours later, when Richard returns, he notices something is not right. When he asks his friends, Stan simply responds by saying that there's been a small problem regarding Jen. Richard goes to the room and asks if she's okay, but Jen keeps insisting that she wants to go back home. Richard finally understands that Stan took advantage of Jen in his absence. As a result, he gets into an argument and fights with his friends for committing such a filthy act. But in order to avoid any further trouble, Richard offers Jen a big amount to forget everything that happened. However, Jen is reluctant and wants to return home. She even threatens him to tell his wife about their relationship. In the heat of the moment, Richard plants a tight slap on her face. Immediately after that, Jen runs away from the house, and Richard, along with his friends, start chasing her. She eventually finds herself at the end of a cliff, where Richard tries to persuade her to get close to her. But surprisingly, he pushes Jen off the cliff to kill her. She falls straight onto a dried tree at the base of the cliff, where the tree penetrates her body and holds her. Stan and Dimitri are startled by this, as they didn't expect Richard to murder his girlfriend. When they ask why he took such a drastic measure, Richard explains that she might have led all of them to 15 years of jail for their actions. Then he tells the boys that they'll carry on with their hunt as if nothing happened. On the other hand, we see Jen, who's still alive, hanging on to the dried tree. Despite all the blood loss and the tree penetrating her body, she's still a little aware of her surroundings. She notices a lighter that she often carries with herself falling nearby. She manages to pick it up and light a fire to destroy the roots of the dried tree so she can get down on the ground. Thinking that Jen is now dead, Richard and his friends are on their way to clean up her dead body. But when Jen hears engine sounds, she knows the men are back to dispose of her body. Gathering all the strength she can, she crawls away to hide from their view. When they arrive at the cliff, they're shocked to find out that Jen is still alive. So, to finish what they started, the three drive down to the base of the cliff. Meanwhile, Jen takes this opportunity to move further away from where she's currently hiding. It's already dark when Richard and his friends arrive at the base of the cliff. They see that Jen has already left, but she's left traces of her blood. This makes it easier for them to track her, and hence they start following her. However, they soon find that the blood trail ends up at a lake, so the three decide to split up and locate her. Richard and Dimitri go in opposite directions, whereas Stan chooses to stay there and look up as she returns. He seems to be scared out of his mind, even though he was brave enough to start all this. It turns out Jen is still in the lake, and when she hears the sound of Dimitri's squad bike, she holds her breath and hides inside. When Dimitri is gone, she comes out of the lake and starts walking to find him. A few moments later, she sees him peeing in the distance, leaving his rifle a little away from him. Jen sees this as an opportunity to take the gun. But unfortunately, Dimitri set this trap to lure her. Dimitri immediately informs his friends that he found Jen and will bring her to the place where they previously split ways. Stan, who was tense and afraid earlier, relaxes and calms down. Now, before taking her back, Dimitri starts to torture her for the trouble she caused. But somehow, Jen grabs a knife from Dimitri and pierces him in his eyes. He starts bleeding tears of blood, and soon enough, he dies. Jen takes all of his weapons and takes his bike to cover some distance, but the bike stops after a while as it runs out of gas. Despite her weakness, she leaves the bike and continues to walk, carrying the bag and the weapons. Finally, after a tiring walk, she reaches a cave and decides to stay there and treat her wound. Inside the cave, Jen empties the bag, where she finds a torchlight and a can of beer, which she gulps down in an instant. As she lies down in pain, suddenly she remembers the hallucinogenic drug that she kept in her locket. She immediately eats it for the sake of strength, even though it has an awful taste. Jen starts having a bizarre experience as she suddenly gains the courage to perform an emergency treatment of her wound. She feels no pain, so she decides to take out the piece of wood from her body. Now, to stop the bleeding, Jen heats the beer can and puts it on top of her wound. The following morning, Stan wakes up to a bloody surprise. Since Richard can't find Jen, he did some hunting instead. The two talk about how Dimitri will soon bring Jen over, and all this will come to an end. Stan walks up to the lake to wash his face, but he's startled by Dimitri's dead body floating in the distance. Seeing his friend dead, he now completely loses it and becomes restless. Richard looks at Dimitri's body carefully and assumes that Jen must have done that. Now they're left with no choice but to dispose of Dimitri's body in the lake. Richard and Stan again decide to split up to find Jen. Even though Stan doesn't want to, Richard leaves without him. While on the other hand, Jen has nightmares as an effect of the hallucinogen. When she wakes up, she sees the bird symbol of the beer bottle imprinted on her. But on the brighter side, her wound is a lot better now. As she starts feeling better, Jen decides to go after her killers instead of running away. She uses binoculars to locate them and sees a car moving in the desert. Soon, when Stan stops to put gas in his car, Jen tries her best to aim the gun at him. She finally pulls the trigger, and the bullet hit him on the shoulder. Since Stan is not severely injured, he tries to run away. But as he moves, he leaves a trail of blood, and this time, Jen is the one to follow it. To stop the bleeding, Stan ties his socks around his shoulder, while he hides and plans to attack from behind. But since he was shot in the shoulder, he misses his aim. After a little chase and some hide-and-seek between them, Jen is successful in killing her abuser. Next, Jen sits in the car where Richard is trying to contact Stan through a radio station. But she doesn't speak a word and keeps driving the car. After trying to contact Stan several times without an answer, Richard concludes that Stan might be killed by Jen. Now, Richard knows he's alone, and on top of that, he's tired and paranoid. So he decides to return home and calls the helicopter to pick him up. He reaches home where he's seen taking a shower, just when he hears a suspicious sound. Richard suspects that Jen has now come for him, so he cautiously goes to check with a gun in his hand. His suspicion turns into reality when Jen shoots Richard as soon as she sees him. But fortunately for Richard, he's still alive and hides behind the sofa. As Jen continues to look for him, Richard wraps his wound with food wraps to prevent blood loss. Just then, Jen slips on the floor filled with his blood. Now Richard gets the upper hand and starts torturing her. Jen is already very weak, so there's nothing much she can do. Instead, she squeezes his wound, and when Richard gives her a little room, Jen quickly picks up the gun and shoots him to death. As the movie comes to an end, a bloodied but triumphant Jen walks out of the house as the helicopter approaches in the distance.